time is about 2.5 hours.
Popularity, I've always thought, may aptly be compared to a coquette. The more you woo her, the more apt is she to elude your embrace. John Tyler.
He was from Virginia, a Southern gentleman, graceful and dignified, with a lilting voice that his much younger wife would remember fondly until her death. But he was also a fiercely independent politician who, as president, alienated an entire party when he refused to adhere to the policies of his predecessor. Vice President John Tyler assumed the presidency in April of 1841 after the death of William Henry Harrison. It was the first time a president had died in office, and no one knew how much power a successor should wield, or whether he should wield any at all. Many figured that Tyler would simply carry forth with Harrison's agenda, and at least one representative thought he should be called acting president. Tyler, however, had other ideas and set a historical precedent when he told his cabinet,
I shall be pleased to avail myself of your counsel and advice, but I can never consent to being dictated to as to what I shall or shall not do.
Never much of a Whig to begin with, Tyler proceeded to follow his conscience rather than the party line. A states' writer and firm believer in limited federal government, he raised the ire of his party colleagues when he repeatedly vetoed Whig-supported legislation. During his single term in office, most of Tyler's cabinet resigned in protest, and his own party expelled him. Senator Henry Clay derisively called him a man without a party. Whigs referred to him as his accidency. The public, for its part, played along, naming that year's influenza epidemic Tyler Grip. Tyler maintained his dignity amid the criticism. English author Charles Dickens visited the White House in 1842 and noted that despite the unrelenting attacks on his leadership, Tyler looked notably presidential.
The expression of his face was mild and pleasant, and his manner remarkably unaffected, gentlemanly, and agreeable. I thought that in his whole carriage and demeanor he became his station singularly well.
Tyler was, in a sense, bred for the part. Born into the slave-holding aristocracy of Virginia, he was the son of a Virginia governor. He studied law and served briefly in the War of 1812 before entering a career in politics. Before becoming vice president, he too had served as Virginia governor, as well as in the House and Senate. He was 23 when he married Letitia Christian, who bore him 8 children before she became ill and died during his second year as president. His second wife, Julia, whom he married 2 years later, bore him 7 more. The beautiful daughter of a New York State senator, Julia was a popular socialite who mortified her well-to-do family by posing for this department store ad in 1840. But that was nothing compared to the scandal surrounding her marriage to Tyler, 30 years her senior. It was the first time a president had been married in office, and the gossip flew about the aging chief executive and his young bride. Representative John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary that the couple was the laughingstock of Washington. The Tylers could have cared less. Julia threw lively White House parties, and Tyler began to enjoy dancing and music. He even learned to approve of the waltz, a dance he had once thought of as vulgar. An amateur musician who was deeply in love with her husband, Julia is one of 2 first ladies credited with first instructing the United States Marine Band to play Hail to the Chief at presidential appearances. Before leaving the president's house, she threw a grand farewell party attended by some 3,000 guests. Afterwards, she noted to Tyler,
"No one can now say that you are a president without a party. I have given you a party."
Following the presidency, Tyler and his wife returned to Sherwood Forest, his 1,200-acre plantation outside Richmond, Virginia. In February of 1861, he traveled to Washington to preside over a peace conference aimed at curbing a civil war. The following November, he was elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, but died before taking his seat. Because of his allegiance to the South, the government took no official notice of his death. He was 71.
If you travel down Virginia's historic Route 5, the John Tyler Highway, 30 miles from the state capitol in Richmond, and along the James River, you'll find Sherwood Forest, home of our 10th president, John Tyler, who served in office from 1841 to 1845. All these years later, Sherwood Forest is still occupied by the Tyler family. It's the home of his grandson, Harrison Tyler, and it's open to the public for tours. Today, we'll be taking you on tour as we learn about the life and times of John Tyler, our 10th president. Here are our guests for the next 2.5 hours. Joining us on our set inside the Tyler home is Dr. Edward Crapole, who is history professor at the College of William and Mary, John Tyler's alma mater. Also, we're joined by Harrison Tyler, the president's grandson, who will help us understand more about his grandfather and family history. And Paney Tyler, Mrs. Harrison Tyler, who will take us on tour of Sherwood Forest. As always, during our American President series, our phone lines will be open. Here's how you participate. 202-624-1111 for people in the eastern half of the United States, and 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We are in a room inside Sherwood Forest, which was once the president's bedroom, and we'll begin with Dr. Edward Crapole. I'm going to ask you, Dr. Crapole, to give us a contemporary historian's view of the Tyler presidency. How has he fared in time?
I would say John Tyler hasn't fared very well. He's very controversial, and I think among most historians, at best, he would be rated as an average president. Some might consider him to be above average. The most recent study of his presidency by Norma Peterson in 1989 said his presidency was flawed, but nonetheless there were significant achievements of his presidency, particularly in the realm of foreign policy.
Since we are in his home, Harrison Tyler, and we're going to be talking a lot about your grandfather, how did Sherwood Forest get its name?
When my grandfather purchased this property, after he had married my grandmother, Julia Gardner, and was living in the White House, this place was called Walnut Grove. But Henry Clay, who had been his antagonist, was furious when John Tyler withdrew his bid for presidency and threw his support to James K. Polk. And Henry Clay made this speech in which he said, call John Tyler an outlaw to the Whig Party, an outlaw, and he's retiring to his Sherwood Forest. John Tyler liked that so much that he changed the name from Walnut Grove to Sherwood Forest. He bought the nameplate that's on the front door, installed it there, and it's there today.
You can visit Sherwood Forest. Even though the family lives here, it's open to the public, and we'll learn more about what you can see and how it all works as our program continues. Again, this series is for you, and our goal is to help you understand more about the individual presidents, their accomplishments, their failures during their presidency, what their contributions were to history, and mostly about their lives. What are the characteristics of leadership? The telephone numbers are on the bottom of the screen. I'm going to give them to you one more time, and we'll go to phones soon. 202-624-1111 for Eastern and Central Time Zone, 202-624-1115 for Mountain and Pacific. Well, Dr. Crapole, let me ask you about the relationship, because if you're driving here down Route 5, as we talked about, you find another president's home very close by, and that is President Harrison, for whom John Tyler served as the vice president. What's the relationship about these men? How is it that they were neighbors?
Well, they're both natives of Charles City County. They were both born here within 5 miles of each other. Their fathers knew each other and were colleagues. William Henry Harrison and John Tyler served in the Congress together. I wouldn't say they had a close relationship, but nonetheless they were friends. And when they were placed on the ticket for the 1840 election, I think it was a political decision rather than a personal decision. I think John Tyler was placed on the ticket to secure the Southern vote and to make sure that the ticket was successful.
The Harrison home is called Berkeley. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between the two families as you know it?
Well, of course, Berkeley has been out of the Harrison family for many years, whereas our home here has remained in the family, and I think is the only presidential home in America that is still owned and lived in by descendants. William Henry Harrison, of course, lived in Ohio, and all of his descendants are scattered throughout the Midwest, and I have met some of them, but am not really close to any of them, I don't think.
Is it just a coincidence that your first name is Harrison?
My grandmother was a Harrison, and my mother wanted a girl, and determined to name whatever came for her side of the family, so she named me Harrison.
John Tyler was the very first at number 10 of the vice presidents to unexpectedly accede to the presidency. Will you talk us through a little bit about what the view was? Did people ever really expect vice presidents to become presidents? And tell us about his coming to the White House.
Well, people did not expect the vice president to become president, and at the time that Harrison died, the assumption was that Tyler would serve as vice president, acting president. John Tyler, I think, was forewarned about Harrison's serious illness. He had received letters from friends, and I think he knew that he might face the possibility of being a vice president who would succeed to the presidency. So I think he planned ahead, and he planned ahead very decisively and successfully. He went to Washington, once being notified of Harrison's death, with the intent of being president and not acting president. He took an oath of office to make sure that his legitimacy as president would be recognized. He gave a speech, some call it an inaugural address, and then he moved to have Congress in, when there was a special session of Congress that Harrison actually had called in late May and early June, he moved to have successfully passed resolutions in both houses recognizing him as president. So one of the big accomplishments of John Tyler is setting this precedent that the vice president will, in fact, become the president in all regards. He will occupy the office, and he will have all of the duties and privileges that go with the presidency.
And this happened just 1 month into the Harrison presidency when President Harrison died and John Tyler became president. He was 51 years old when he took the oath of office. Let's take our first telephone call. It's from Bust-Eye, New York.
Hello, Susan. It's a pleasure talking with you today, and I'm really enjoying your presidential series.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to find out if John Tyler had any ties to the Masonic fraternity and also his family's ties.
Thank you. Harrison Tyler.
I'm not sure. I've never heard mention of that, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't. I'm just not sure.
And your own family, as it continued through generations, you never heard of any particular connections with the Masons?
Not that I'm aware of.
Ladewood, Illinois. Good morning, as we talk about John Tyler.
Hello, Susan.
Good morning.
I'm actually a fifth great-grandson of John Tyler, so I guess Harrison and I are distantly related. How you do?
Hi.
I was wondering if there was any information about John Tyler's son, the first one that was named John Tyler. That's the line that I'm descended through. And which of his sons are you? Which of his sons was your father, sir, if I may ask?
Well, thanks. Actually, Harrison Tyler, I'm going to ask you, because we haven't talked about how many children, the fact that there were 2 wives, each bearing children. Why don't you set up the whole family situation for us with President Tyler?
Well, John Tyler was married twice. His first wife was Letitia Christian. He had 8 children by his first wife. Then she died in the White House, and he married Julia Gardner in 2 years later, and lived in the White House with her and brought her here to Sherwood Forest, where they had 7 children. My father was the 5th child of the second set, which would be actually the 13th child. His name was Lyon Gardner Tyler, and we lived on part of the property next door and moved here in 1975.
With 15 children, that puts John Tyler where in the presidents, Dr. Crapo?
I think he has the most.
The most.
Yeah,
and today there must be Tyler descendants in great numbers.
Can you ask again which
from John Tyler?
Which John Tyler the caller is descended from?
First group of children, and he said the first John Tyler.
I think that may have been a previous generation.
So there's no John Tyler among his sons?
There was John Tyler Jr., but the only descendants are named Shands.
Thank you for that call. I expect that since there are so many Tyler descendants, we'll hear from a few during our program. You were telling us last night that you've recently had a family reunion of the Tylers. How many did you gather?
Well, we're still working on the final count, but there were nearly 200 here altogether, including family members. We think that there were some 120 actual descendants or closely related descendants and closely related members of the family. Many of them are from his two brothers. John Tyler had Watt Henry Tyler and William Tyler as brothers, and Watt Henry has many descendants, and many of them were here.
Next call is from Bladewood, Illinois. You are on the air. Good morning, caller. Illinois, are you there for us?
Yes.
What's your question, please?
My question is, would you please say a little about John Tyler, the president's two brothers, Watt and William, who also lived in Charles City County and were born at Greenway?
Thank you very much. Well, let's start with what is Greenway?
Greenway was John Tyler's birthplace, where his father and mother lived, and there were 6 children by that marriage, and there were 3 boys, well, actually 7, because there were 4 girls and 3 boys, Watt Henry Tyler and William Tyler. Now, Watt Henry Tyler, of course, grew up there in Charles City, but his first wife was in Williamsburg. He was a doctor, and he lived in Williamsburg. His first wife died, and then he moved to near Richmond in Hanover County and lived there the rest of his life. And there are many descendants, many of whom live here in Virginia, of Watt Henry, and many of them are very fine and very close and dear friends.
We're looking at pictures of Greenway Plantation. How far is it from this house?
It's 5 miles west.
Is it open to the public for tour?
No, it's not.
Who owns it today?
A family in Germany that own timber. They bought the property for its timber, but they do maintain it, and they are very, very nice people. They visit very sporadically, though.
Dr. Krapel, how far away from us is William and Mary College and Williamsburg?
It's about 30 miles as well from Sherwood Forest, and the college, which is the second oldest in the nation, was founded in 1693. John Tyler was an alum. He attended there. He was there in 1806. He was also, throughout his life, a strong supporter of the college at various stages, and late in his life he served as chancellor of the college as well in 1859 to his death.
Do you know how many presidents are associated with William and Mary?
Do I know how many presidents? We claim George Washington, we claim Thomas Jefferson, we claim James Monroe and John Tyler, all as people associated with the College of William and Mary.
The room in which we are right now is not open to the public for tour, but we're going to begin the process of showing you a little bit more of this house. Let me introduce you to Paney Tyler, who will join us in the front hall of Sherwood Forest. Good morning, Ms. Tyler.
Good morning, and I'd like to welcome our viewers to Sherwood Forest Plantation. This house constitutes over a century and a half of living by one family in one plantation, the Tyler family, and it is still today the only presidential home in America that is lived in and owned by the president's family. I think it might be interesting for you to know that John Tyler had a total of 15 children, the record for any president, and in this home, he and his wife, Julia Gardner of Gardner's Island, New York, reared 7 children. I would like to point out some of the architectural detail of the home first, because this house was primarily an 18th century house, which John Tyler decided to, quote, fancy up when he came in it. I think this might have been Julia's idea. Through the, what was at one time, the Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission, but today is the Virginia Historic Resources Commission, their authority on Virginia architect, whom I absolutely adore, is named Calder Loth. And Calder was of exceeding help to us in the restoration of this house. If you look at the doors, he brought me books called The Beauty of Modern Architecture, which showed that these were doors designed by a Menard Lafave, who was a New York architect. The grounds were designed by Andrew Jackson Downing, who was also a New York landscape architect, and all of this came from Julia Gardner, whose home is the longest held land grant in America in one family. Today it is owned jointly by Robert David Lyon Gardner and by his niece, Mrs. Goulet, and it has been in their family since the mid-1600s. They are my husband's second cousins. Now, this is a portrait of President Tyler, and this portrait was done during his term in office. His term in office was 1841 to 1845. He and his wife, when they retired from the presidency, came to Sherwood Forest by carriage in the spring, March 1845. And I love one of Julia's expressions. Julia was a very capable woman. She spoke several languages. She was very wealthy. She was very beautifully educated. When she first came here and she saw the ground, she wrote to her mother, "The hand of God and nature have been kind to my beloved Sherwood Forest, but I can improve upon it." And I think she did. She used her mother and her two brothers, who were in New York, both Princeton graduates, as her sources for furniture. So you will find in this house today a great deal of furniture from New York. The New York connection is very, very strong. I would like to show you Julia Gardner's portrait, which is behind me. And this is a portrait of Julia when she was in her late teens. She married President Tyler when she was 24, and he was 54. I think that there was a little togetherness here for the rest of their lives. I have no doubt that it was a great love affair, for I read pretty constantly from 47,410 personal letters and correspondence at William and Mary and at Yale, and also a few at the Van Rensselaer Institute, in which they're very personal letters that discuss their relationship. I do think when he was married, he was the president, and she was one of the richest women in America, and I think it was a very good union. One of the things that Julia wanted to do when she first became the president's bride was to redecorate the White House. And Tyler, having been the first vice president to succeed to the presidency, and was not looked upon very kindly by Henry Clay, who very much wanted to be president. So Henry Clay persuaded Congress not to give them any money, $50 actually, for the decoration. So Julia took her own monies and decorated the White House. One of the things that she bought that is fully recorded is this particular table here on the left, which she ordered from France. She paid $45 for it. She got it home and said she thought it was Italian. This was here during the war between the states, and you can see damage inflicted upon the floor, here at the bottom, and upon the bottom of the table by Union troops who entered the house during that particular period. She also ordered at the same time 2 dogs, greyhounds, which she said she felt would grace the White House lawn. Over here, I will show you another family portrait, which is of my daughter, who is Julia Gardner Tyler Samaniego. She lives in Rancho Santa Fe, California. She's Mrs. Daniel Samaniego. And this was taken of Julia doing what she has always loved most, playing polo. And the fox head above is a gift from the master foxhounds of the Deep Run Hunt Club, given to Julia. Normally they give a brush. However, in this instance, Kenan Perrin's wife brought her, at the request of Kenan Perrin, his own mask.
Ms. Tyler, let me stop you at that point, because we have a few calls backed up, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
We will learn a little bit more about some of the artifacts in the house that help us understand the Tylers. Let's take a telephone call from Visalia, California. You are on the air. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. The pictures on the wall there, it's my understanding that Tyler was the first president to have his picture taken by photograph, and I think it was about 1844. Could you confirm that or correct me on that?
Thank you.
I think that's correct. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that's correct. He was the first to have his photograph taken.
One of the history books that we have here have a few other firsts that occurred during his presidency. Goodyear got the first patent for rubber during that time period. The Congress appropriated money for the telegraph to be experimented upon, and the first news was sent by telegraph during his presidency. And also a treaty with China was signed. Can you tell us any more about that?
I can. Yes, during his presidency, he and his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, were very interested in expanding American influence in the Pacific. They were, as a number of historians have noted, they were Pacific-minded. They were interested in gaining access to ports on the western coast of North America and California for the United States. They also, in 1842, Tyler and Webster issued what's known as the Tyler Doctrine, which extended American influence into the Pacific and guaranteed the independence of Hawaii, or the Sandwich Islands as they were known. And as part of that, Tyler, and again this is Tyler the nationalist rather than simply a champion of the Old South, Tyler sought to appeal to northern commercial interests, and Webster was very influential as well, and so they sought the United States' first treaty with China. Caleb Cushing, a New Englander, was sent as the U.S. Representative to get the United States' first treaty, which they did in 1844. Now, Webster by that time had resigned as Secretary of State, but he was instrumental in setting it up. And in that particular treaty, which was precedent-setting, the United States gained access to ports in China, received the privileges of extraterritoriality, and established the principle of the most favored nation.
And here we are 150 years later, still talking about most favored nation status and trading with China. Next call is from Port Chester, New York. Welcome, you're on the air.
Hello, C-SPAN. Thank you so much for doing this. I've loved every installment of this. I have a question for Mr. Harrison. When you said that there was going to be the grandson of Mr. Harrison Tyler, when you said you were going to have the grandson of John Tyler, I was actually expecting a gentleman who'd be about like 101 years old. Mr. Tyler is not 101 years old, obviously. I'm wondering if he can explain the chronology, of the family history. Obviously, his father was the son of the second marriage. How old was his father when John Tyler died? And was he also the one of the younger children of a very large family?
Thank you. That caller had the same reaction that everyone I said, we're going to talk to President Tyler's grandson, all said the same thing. My goodness, are you sure you don't mean great-grandson? Can you talk about your history?
My grandfather was born in 1790, and he was married, had 8 children by his first wife. His first wife died. He married again, had 7 children. My father was the 5th child of the second set, born in 1853. My father emulated his father by being married, having 3 children. His first wife died. He married again, had 2 more children. I was born in 1928, but there are some mornings that I do feel 101.
Don't we all, Mr. Tyler? Dr. Crapola, that caller, actually when we were talking with Mrs. Tyler, she mentioned the personal letters which are at the College of William and Mary. How many of President Tyler's papers are preserved for historians?
Well, there are papers preserved at the College of William and Mary, and as she mentioned, there are some from the Gardner family at Yale University. There also is a small collection at the Virginia Historical Society. Unfortunately for historians, however, a goodly number of Tyler's papers were burned when the Confederates were retreating from Richmond in 1865, and a great deal of his personal papers were lost. But nonetheless, with what we have at William and Mary, and there's also a presidential collection in the Library of Congress, there's fairly good documentation for his presidency and his life.
Auburn, Alabama, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to compliment you and congratulate you on a superb program. This is the first time I've had a chance to observe it. My question for Mr. Tyler is there a direct relationship to Wat Tyler, who led the peasant revolt against Richard II and was treacherously murdered in England?
We think so. My father went to England to actually research that question and discovered a good part of the line in England, but wasn't able to absolutely establish that we are descended from Wat Tyler, but he did name, his father had named one of his children Wat Tyler. So I think that we all felt that we are descended from Wat Tyler, but I don't think we have absolute proof of that.
Brady, Texas, you're next. Go ahead, please.
All right.
What's your question for us?
This is Brian Callahan, Brady, Texas. I was born in Tyler, Texas, and I want to know if and what the history of the name of that town was after John Tyler. I believe it was. And secondly, I understand that his second wife helped him raise his last 2 or 3 children. Please let us know that.
All right, thanks. Tyler, Texas, leads us to the whole question of the annexation of Texas, a big issue during the Tyler presidency. Would you take that up, Dr. Crapo?
Surely. Tyler, Texas is in recognition of John Tyler's, it's a town or city named to honor John Tyler and to acknowledge his role in the annexation of Texas. John Tyler wanted to annex Texas almost immediately. Texas had established its independence, and the previous administration, before the Harrison administration and Tyler administration, Van Buren had not sought the annexation of Texas. Texans wanted to be annexed to the United States, and the reason that it was controversial was because it would add slave states to the Union. So John Tyler, early on, was interested in annexing Texas to sort of make his mark as a president. His first Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, however, a Northerner, not a supporter of slavery, was not keen on annexing Texas. So Tyler essentially waited on his move to annex Texas, and after Webster resigned, they sort of split on that issue. His next Secretary of State, Abel Upshur, actually secured a treaty of annexation with Texas, and in January of 1844, it appeared that there was sufficient support in the Senate for the approval of this treaty. However, Upshur was killed on the explosion of Princeton in late February 1844, and his replacement as Secretary of State was John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun also wanted the annexation of Texas, but he made it an issue of slavery and the expansion of slavery. And consequently, that treaty then was defeated in the Senate because it became identified with the expansion of slavery. Tyler nonetheless remained interested in the annexation of Texas, and after the election of Polk in 1844 and before he left office, one of the last things he did was to secure the approval of an annexation treaty by a joint resolution of Congress. And that's another one of his precedents. He set this precedent of essentially finessing the Senate's role in terms of approving such a treaty by getting a joint resolution. And that approach cast a long shadow over American expansion in the 19th century. Following presidents look back at Tyler's example. Grant, when he faced resistance to his efforts to annex Santo Domingo, brought up whether or not he shouldn't follow John Tyler's precedent or example. He did not. And then the other example is Hawaii. William McKinley, as president in 1898, could not get a treaty through the Senate either, a treaty of annexation. And so he emulated Tyler and had a joint resolution for the annexation of Hawaii.
We move from policy back to the home and family life here at Sherwood Forest. Painey Tyler joins us once again in the dining room of the family home at Sherwood Forest. I'm going to ask you to explain how the ex-president, the former president, and his wife entertained. How did they use this house socially after the presidency?
Rather lavishly. Julia enjoyed entertainment. They entertained every visitor that came in this direction. One of the letters that we have is from Julia's sister Margaret, who describes a ball that was held at Sherwood Forest in the 1840s. I believe 1848 is the date. She was a Mrs. Beekman from the state of New York, and Margaret Gardner Beekman described the ball as having over 100 guests. The carriages were held in the yard. The horses were unhitched. They had a ball in the ballroom. They danced until 1 o'clock when they served the first breakfast. They danced until 3 o'clock when they served the second breakfast. And according to Julia, they served the finest champagne, which was still flowing lavishly as the sun came up. This is their dining room, their personal room for dining. The kitchen is a separate building at the eastern end of the house, which was actually built in the late 1600s, when part of this house was a smaller house with an earlier plantation. This entire house did not initially look as it does today. It rather grew like Topsy, and Julia was responsible for its architectural and its interior design. The china that you see here on the dining room table, we think, I will pick it up and show it to you. This is, we are almost sure, old Paris. It has, other than our personal label for identification here on the back, it has nothing but the potter's wheel mark. Incidentally, yesterday I was at a plantation called Bremo, the home of a General Koch, and they had almost the same service. Theirs was identical to this, except it did not have the gold leaves on it. So this was in use in the 1840 period. This china was stolen from this house during the period of the war between the states. It came up for auction in 1922 and was bought by a man who lived at Edgemont, Parker Sneed's father, in near Charlottesville. And when Parker died, we were able to bring what was remaining, which is a substantial amount, back to the house. Tyler used it for his own use when he lived in Williamsburg, and then he carried it with him to the White House. He did not have any presidential china. And when asked why he didn't purchase any, he said, I will use my own and Harrison's and save the taxpayers some money. So we're very delighted that we can say that our china was used in the White House.
Ms. Tyler, let me ask you a question, because all of the houses we've been able to visit on this tour so far have been preserved as museums. And I'm sure you've been to some of them as well, Monticello, Montpelier, and the like.
Yes.
What would you say is the difference for visitors to come into a home that is an actual family home, still used by the family, you live here, versus those that are preserved specifically for tour and historic preservation?
Well, I think it's a great deal more personal. It is in some ways slightly difficult for us to be able to adjust to this, but more difficult for the people who work here, who are accustomed to state-run museums, to see me coming down the stairs early in the morning in my house coat, or to be taking a tour and have my Toodle Poodle race through the middle of the tour. On one occasion, I was riding horseback in our driveway when an unexpected tour broker arrived with his bus. And I cantered alongside the bus, got off of my horse, tied him to a tree, came inside and gave a tour of the house. And that tour broker had never been here before. However, he brought me constant business after that on one principle. If I would meet him at the gate on my horse and canter beside the bus and get off, he would bring tours. So I think that a personal touch of a family living in the home is a great addition to an historic house museum.
Why don't you stay right on camera? We'll take a call from Washington, D.C., and we will hear what they have to say or ask. Hello, Washington.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the Tylers for the wonderful job they're doing. I visited Sherwood Forest last spring, and I just loved it. I have a question for the professor. I actually have two. One is about John Tyler's several party switches. He began his career as a Southern Democrat, or I guess Jeffersonian Republican, joined the Whigs somehow, fought with the Whigs, became a Democrat later on. Could you take us through the chronology, and what about him was a Democrat, what about him was a Whig? There were a lot of other states' rights Democrats like Andrew Jackson, so that quite doesn't do it for me. When we get to the Civil War, there's a wonderful story about Julia Tyler and the Union Army coming through Sherwood Forest. That's a true story. Perhaps one of you can comment on that. I know President Andrew Johnson pardoned her. He did not posthumously pardon John Tyler, so he's the one president who has died a non-citizen, and I guess it's still that today. Finally, I hail from Princeton, New Jersey. We have the Bell, the U.S. Princeton, and the house in front of it, behind it, is Morven, the home of Commodore Robert Stockton, who came up with the idea of that event. Perhaps you can tell us about it. It's the first time 2 cabinet officers were killed in the line of duty, and I'll stay on the line. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Actually, I appreciate that because you've given us one question which I'll direct to each of our guests. Painey Tyler, would you take the question the caller asked about Julia Tyler and the Union Army? You know that story?
Well, I do, but I don't remember what his question was.
He wanted to. He specifically said there is a story about the Union Army coming through the home and Julia Tyler.
Well, the Union Army was encamped at Fort Pocahontas, which is a fort which my husband is restoring. In fact, he's having a wonderful reenactment there next Sunday. at 1 o'clock. And the Union troops came here to Sherwood Forest, and they entered the house, and they did attempt to take quite a number of things with them, and they rather laid waste to a few things. Julia thereafter left Richmond and went with bales of cotton and she said, her finest silks and satins, and her dining room and drawing room curtains, which were also silk, went to the open port of Wilmington, North Carolina, and she became at that time, a blockade runner, and carried her children, which is quite remarkable, and she carried the cotton to Bermuda, where she had to stay for a bit. Her purpose was to escape and get to New York because this territory was within Union lines. And so she did leave this area, and she was successful in selling her cotton, I believe, for $15,000, which is quite an amazing amount of money at that time. However, cotton was in rare demand by England, and then she went to the state of New York, where she stayed there throughout the war.
And the question on party politics, which I'll turn to you, Dr. Kraypol, is really a very important one because John Tyler became the first president without a party in the White House.
That's correct. As the caller noted, he started out as a Jeffersonian Republican, and he always considered himself as a follower of Jefferson and Madison. He did support the Democrats. He then was a Democrat, and he became disillusioned with Andrew Jackson. He felt Andrew Jackson was becoming a much too strong executive, and he essentially broke then with the Democrats and was identified with the Whigs. But I think his relationship with the Whigs was always tenuous, and he was placed on the ticket in 1840 with William Henry Harrison, part of that Whig ticket. But I think from John Tyler's viewpoint, he never made any commitments about a Whig program or any commitment to Henry Clay's American system. And so consequently, when he does take over as president, he feels that he's independent of the Whigs, and he is a president without a party. Before he leaves, he was notified of Harrison's death in Williamsburg. He was living in Williamsburg at the time, and before he left, he spoke to one of his friends, Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, about his predicament, not having a party. And Tucker said, well, you know, you should build a party, find a party, and Tyler said, well, I have no opportunity to do that. So during his presidency, he really is a president without a party. He is ostracized, certainly, by the Whigs. They are very angry with him, and Clay...
Openly hostile at times.
Openly hostile. John Tyler suffered great abuse in terms of he was burned in effigy. He was censured once for a veto of his veto of a tariff. There were calls for his impeachment. So he suffered mightily for not having a party, and I think his standing in history is influenced by that. I think that most people look at it from the viewpoint of the Whigs rather than the viewpoint of Tyler. And Tyler, by 1843-44, was trying to mount a sort of third-party candidacy so that he could seek re-election in 1844. He was unsuccessful, and he really framed the campaign for Polk and Polk's platform in terms of expansionism. And so he then became identified once again as a Democrat.
Quick question for you. With all the change in our situation, perhaps it's not a good comparison, but we saw during the last two presidential cycles a third-party candidacy mounted by the Reform Party and Ross Perot. Is it at all instructive to look back at the Tyler presidency and see what it would be like with essentially a third-party president, a president without an official party in the Congress?
Well, I think it's instructive in Tyler's case, a president without a party. He never really is able to mount a legislative program. And I think that's the reason he turns to foreign policy as an area in which he can at least have some accomplishments. And I think he hoped, as a Madisonian, to use foreign policy to overcome sectionalism, to overcome domestic issues that stood in his way. And so what's instructive is that he had a very contentious relationship with Congress and never really mounted a legislative program. And so his areas of accomplishment are not in terms of legislation, but rather in the realm of setting a precedent, becoming the first vice president to become president, and also his foreign policy accomplishments. I would include Hawaii, Texas, the treaty with China, and so on.
Dr. Edward Kraypol of the College of William and Mary, John Tyler's alma mater. He's currently working on a book, a biography of the 10th president. Also our guests and our hosts here at Sherwood Forest, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison Tyler. Harrison Tyler is the grandson of our 10th president. Mr. Tyler, I'm going to ask you to take the caller's third question, which was about the explosion of the Princeton. He wanted to know some of the details of it.
Well, there's quite a love story involved in that. Following John Tyler's, the death of Letitia Christian, John Tyler's first wife, he was, of course, alone in the White House. One of his daughter-in-laws served as the hostess. But they continued to have many functions and parties, and of course John Tyler began to notice some of the ladies, and in particular he noticed the daughter of the senator from Long Island, Julia Gardner. She would accompany her father to Washington, and she loved to go to balls. She was in her early 20s and was quite beautiful, and he paid her a lot of attention, but she had many young officers with and really, she was flattered by the president's attention, but she really didn't pay that much notice of him until they cruised down the Potomac on the Princeton. Now, the Princeton was a warship that had just recently been launched. It had the largest gun ever mounted on any ship, and dubbed the Peacemaker. And the idea was that America would become a power in the seas with such a warship with such a gun on it. Captain Stockton thought it was a great idea to invite everybody to gain support for the Navy, to invite all the political personages of the day on a cruise down the Potomac. So in March of, I think it was late February of 1844, 350 guests assembled at the Anacostia Navy Yard. They cruised down the Potomac. They were accompanied by carriages on the road paralleling the Potomac. They got to near Dahlgren, where the river makes a long right turn, a left turn, and fired the gun. It was a great success. The captain called for everyone to come to the Grand Salon downstairs for refreshments. They poured champagne, toasts were given, but many of the guests wanted to fire the gun again. So as they were returning, they were passing George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, and the suggestion was made, let's fire the gun in salute to our, in honor of our first president. The gun was fired, but this time it exploded. The left breech blew out, killing Abel Upshur, Secretary Gilmer, and David Gardner, the father of Julia Gardner. Julia was still downstairs, surrounded by a bevy of naval officers. They were all trained for duty, so as soon as the ship rocked and there was they knew something was wrong, they all rushed up to assume their duty, leaving her alone. She ran to the gangplank because she knew her father was upstairs. John Tyler, seeing his opportunity, fell in right behind her. They mounted the stairs, came to the deck just as a sailor ran from the front of the ship saying, "Don't let Miss Gardner forward, her father is dead." When Julia heard this, she fainted, but the president caught her in his arms, took her back downstairs, laid her on a bunk, and commanded that the ship go to the shore at the nearest dock. And when it docked, he picked her up and carried her tenderly down the gangplank. And actually she came to as they were going down the gangplank. She struggled, but she later told her mother that when she regained consciousness and she looked up and she saw John Tyler's face close to hers, that she realized that he loved her deeply. She had loved her father dearly. Her father and John Tyler were the same age. Supposedly she transferred the affection of her father to John Tyler because they were married 3 months later.
Fort Myers, Florida, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning, and I am delighted to be part of this show. My name at birth was Charlotte Tyler Darling. My mother is also Charlotte Tyler. I've been told, I was born in 48, that I am a granddaughter, how many ever back. I have several comments and then a question for the doctor. My oldest son's name is Caleb. I find that to be an irony. I'm very interested in knowing why during the Clinton problems that we've recently had, there was no mention about the infamous impeachment the move to impeach President John Tyler. There was no mention of that at all. In fact, I find throughout history that there's very little mentioned about our President John Tyler. Also, I would love to know if there is a web address where I can gather information, more information about the lineage of this family. Hi, Harrison. So good to see you. You're an extremely good-looking gentleman. To end this, I would like to share that I am an avid gardener of roses, though not Tyler roses from Texas. I am a Floridian. At that, I'm going to let all of you try to address my questions.
Thank you. Is there a web address that for people?
Yes, there is one. I don't know I can't give you the number, but there is one for Sherwood Forest, and also there is one for John Tyler. I think you can look them up.
We have it on the screen right now. It's www.sherwoodforest, all one word, .org, and on that site you'll learn about the history of this home and of the presidency, and then also links to other sites, so it is possible. The caller asked about the impeachment movement and why we don't hear more about it in contemporary history. We did hear lots of talk about the Andrew Johnson impeachment, but not Tyler recently.
Yeah, that's correct. A few historians did go back to Tyler and indicate that he faced at least the effort of impeachment in Congress, but because he was never impeached, and because we had the example of Andrew Johnson in an actual trial, I think that took precedent. One legal historian, Paul Finkelman, I did see a letter he wrote to the Post. He brought up Tyler in the context of censure and the fact that he was facing impeachment, and actually his argument was that if the Congress wanted to censure Bill Clinton, it certainly had a precedent.
Let's return to the home. I would like to show you, we have a chart of what this home looks like here, and you can get a sense of the fact that it is very long and only one room wide, which is done for climate reasons, because this is a very, very humid climate here in the Tidewater area. Having one room depth in the house allowed you to open up doors and windows and allow some of the air to circulate through. So we're making our way through some of the rooms that are on tour, open for tour if you come to visit Sherwood Forest. And let me ask Haney Tyler to tell us exactly where you're going next from the dining room.
When we complete the dining room, we will pass through the entrance hall, and then we will go into the drawing room. Before we leave this room, I wanted to point out one thing to our viewers today, and that is the wallpaper. This is a copy arranged by Calder Loth of the Virginia Landmarks Commission, a copy of the original paper. Julia Gardner, and your caller, said she liked to grow roses. Julia loved roses and the passion flower, and here you see an example of the flowers, and to the left, she was an avid sailor. Having grown up on Gardiner's Island, she knew quite well how to sail. And as I said, she sailed through the Union blockade, and she kept her own boat on the plantation called the Pocahontas, manned by oarsmen with pantaloons and white shirts and JTT on the collars. Now, if you follow me, we'll go into the hall, and then we will go into the drawing room.
We'll follow you.
Thank you.
Possible to take a telephone call as we're walking from one room to the next?
Well, we're here. Would you like me to continue?
Why don't we take this call and stay where you are? You'll listen in. We'll come right back to you. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Go ahead.
Good morning to C-SPAN.
Good morning.
And, thanks for doing this series, Susan. Who, in my opinion, is the most attractive woman in television. I got a quick question for you. Did President Tyler commute back and forth from Washington to his home there during his presidency, or did he stay in Washington the whole time? And if he did commute, I was curious as to know if he went by boat or horseback.
Harrison Tyler.
He did not buy Sherwood Forest until 1842, well into his presidential term, and he bought it intending to bring his first wife, Letitia Christian. The home needed a great deal of repair, so he only visited here a few times, and of course when she died, and then he married my grandmother, Julia Gardner, he brought her here, and she really supervised the renovation and the construction. So no, he did not visit here much, did not stay here during his term in office.
What would be the typical mode of transportation for him between the Tidewater area and the federal capital?
The best way was by boat. that you could take the boat from, I think, the Anacostia Naval Yard and go to Norfolk and then transfer to a packet that ran up and down the James River every day.
Annie Tyler, let's pick up the tour with you again.
We're in the drawing room, and I think one of the points that I would like to tell you about in the drawing room is that President Tyler opened the trade routes to China, which had been closed heretofore. He sent Caleb Cushing as his ambassador, and there's a very poignant letter from the Chinese emperor to Tyler. When Cushing returned, he brought with him many artifacts from China, and you will see a number of these here in the room. Prior to his trip to China, when the trade routes were open, the cost of tea per pound in the United States had been a vacillating price of from $85 to $100 per pound of tea. It's a little expensive. So tea was a very precious commodity. This is a very small tea caddy, which you can see here. Your tea was put in here and tightly locked. Here's the little lock in the front. Then the tea was in the inside of the caddy, and it was taken out very carefully. A larger example of this particular social process is shown over here. This is known as a tea poi, P-O-Y. It is made out of rosewood, and happily, I think it's lined in lead. Isn't that wonderful that we don't have to drink tea lined in lead today? And each of these held the 4 different types of tea that were available, and in these were what was called a waste, so that after you served the tea, you would put the waste into glass containers in these compartments. Here is a tea set of the period. It's called Rose Medallion, and you can see this very clearly. It does have a medallion on the side. It has Mandarin figures on the side, and here you have the rose showing. This was used, the tea and the tea service, and then here is a child's tea service. Children were all over this house, all over the rooms, all of the time. And so they had their own little tea services also. The chair, which you see here, was brought from Switzerland later on in the, I would say, the third quarter of the 19th century. And it's a musical chair. It works wonders. When you press the seat, it plays. When the child gets up, it ceases to play.
Well, let me ask you a question about children.
Yes.
You've explained to us that seven children of Julia Gardner Tyler were born in this home.
Yes.
Did the children from the first marriage also come to join?
Yes, they did. Some of them were, the majority of them were actually older than Julia Gardner. A little problem, I think, arose with those older children. However, the younger children stayed here with Julia. They were in their late teens. It was Tazewell and Alice who stayed here in the house with her.
Let me take a call from Rockville, Maryland. Good morning.
Yes. I believe that John Page, who is buried at Williamsburg at Bruton Parish and had quite a large middle plantation there, I believe he left a lot of land to his grandson, who was John Tyler. And I just wondered, is Sherwood Forest, the plantation, part of the original Page plantation?
No, it's not part of the Page plantation, but I am descended from John Page. His granddaughter married Henry Tyler, who was the father of John Tyler, that John Page left a great deal of property and things too. There were 2 Henry Tylers. Henry owned the other part of Middle Plantation. Between John Page and Henry Tyler, they owned all of Williamsburg. There were 2 Henry Tylers in a row, and then 4 John Tylers, ending with my grandfather.
Charles City County, which is where this home is, I've been told by some of the folks who live here, is still one of the smallest in population sizes of the counties in Virginia, about 7,000 residents. You might be interested in knowing that today this county is about 70% black, about 5% Chickahominy Indian, who were one of the earliest residents here, and about 25% white. And it is, as you can see from the many pictures we've shown you this morning, still a very rural area. Culture and timber harvesting, one of the major economic contributors here. Tourism, also very important in the area. Having grown up around here, describe the Tidewater area.
Well, I want to mention that I am descended from Pocahontas, so that I am part Indian. But it's, I grew up on the banks of the James River, and with our cypress swamps and all of our wildlife and there's much more wildlife. The river is much purer today than it was when I was a child. There's a picture of the river. We're on the river on our boat. We cruise up and down, as much as we can during the summer months, and we love it here.
Is it just coincidence, Dr. Crapo, that this tidewater gave birth to 2 presidents?
No, I don't think it's just coincidence. I think that Virginians were very important in the American Revolution, and I think that the ideas that were generated by the American Revolution, with all due respect to Massachusetts, many of those came from Virginians, and I think that Jefferson, for instance, was friendly with John Tyler's father, and John Tyler, the president, did in fact know Jefferson and had met him, and so I think there was a certain continuity there in terms of Jeffersonian ideas and political commitment. And I think that John Tyler, as a member of the aristocracy, was a descendant of that political legacy. So I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence. I think it can be explained.
John Tyler, in addition to his service in the White House, served as in the Virginia House, the U.S. House of Representatives. He served as Virginia's governor, was a member of the United States Senate, and then vice president. And then after his presidency, as the secession movement grew, he then was elected a member of the Confederate Congress, but never had a chance to serve. He died before that session took place. Richmond, Virginia, as we talk about John Tyler, you're next. Good morning, Richmond.
Hello.
You have a question for us?
Yes, more or less a statement rather than a question. I'm surprised that you haven't made mention of the fact that for the first time in history, and very likely the last time in history, both the president and the vice president were from the same state.
We've mentioned it a couple of times.
You did?
Yeah, early on.
Yeah, I missed it then. Okay.
Well, thanks. Have you been to Sherwood Forest since you live so close by?
Many times.
And what can you tell us that people might want to learn here?
You're doing such a good job. I haven't learned anything that I didn't already know.
Well, thank you for your telephone call. As you mentioned, the president and vice president from the same state. In fact, John Tyler, because he came into office after the death of Harrison, had no vice president.
That's correct. The vice presidency was never filled during his entire administration.
And was there any notice of it particularly, that we had no vice president? Or did it make a difference in the governing of the country?
No, I don't believe it did. It didn't seem to bother people, and I think most of the energy was focused on John Tyler and the split between the Whigs and John Tyler and the acrimony within the Congress, and so the issue of the vice presidency never really became something of importance.
Harrison Tyler, what is it like to be a grandson of someone when you hear words like controversial and a troubled presidency and the like? How do you process that through your own relation to this man?
Well, I really don't hear that much. It's seldom brought up in that context. I think that John Tyler's presidency was not fully understood, and we're very thankful to Dr. Crapo, who is writing a book to bring some of the things that he did accomplish, into the public conscious.
What's most misunderstood about John Tyler?
What's most misunderstood? Well, I think the thing that, if people know about John Tyler to begin with, I think he's a fairly obscure president, and what's most misunderstood is, I think, the feeling that he accomplished nothing, that he simply broke with the Whig Party, and John Tyler, I think, he suffers a bit because of all the other great figures in that period, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and so on. I think sort of John Tyler it doesn't come to the forefront as a consequence. But I think to answer your question directly, he had significant accomplishments. He set a number of important precedents, and I think in some ways he shaped the presidency in a way that it exists today. He helped, and this is one of those things that's not understood about Tyler. He's usually seen as a states' writer and a champion of the Old South, but actually when in office, he was quite willing to use the powers of the presidency, and I think that his legacy, which I don't think is frequently understood, is that he did improve the position of the presidency. He did strengthen it. He did that particularly in foreign policy, but he gave legitimacy to the office. The Whigs were intent on congressional control, limiting the control of the president, and I think Tyler's legacy is to play a role in changing the institution of the presidency. And there may be music historians out there who can dispute this, but as a sense of not only the various levees and celebrations that he hosted in the White House, he began the tradition of playing Hail to the Chief late in his presidency. This was taken over by Mrs. Polk. She I think, gets most credit for it, but it began in Tyler's presidency.
I'm glad you gave us that fact, because we had that question during Martin Van Buren's program, and the historian said, no, not MVB.
That's right.
So now we know. John Tyler, Hail to the
correct.
Chief. Let's return as we talk about Sherwood Forest, John Tyler's home after the presidency, to Painey Tyler. What's next?
Well, from the drawing room, we're going to walk into what's known as the Gray Room. The Gray Room was actually a family sitting room known by two names, the Gray Room and the Parlor. Now, its name is derived from the fact that there is a ghost that lives in this house whose name is the Gray Lady. And if ever one has lived in this house, you don't question whether it's haunted or not. Apparently, there was a small child who died, and this was the nurse of the small child. She can be heard walking across the second floor, coming down the stairs, which are in a closet here. There are 7 different sets of stairs in the entire house. And sometimes she drags something that bumps on the stairs with her. These stairs in the corner here are known as the fold-down stairs. What you're seeing is a portrait at the top of Thomas Jefferson. You're seeing, may I show you the flag over the door, please, which was flown by Julia Gardner on the little boat when she was the blockade runner. It's not really the Southern flag. It's a flag made for her by her sister, Margaret Gardner Beekman, when they were children, but it was so close that Julia Gardner used it as the flag during that period. Here is a picture of Martha Washington, which was given to the Harrisons at Berkeley, and that's a rather interesting thing, and this is one of the reproductions reproduced immediately after the war between the states of the Great Seal of the Confederacy, and its purpose was to give them to, they were done in bronze and copper, persons who had contributed immeasurably to the Confederate cause. And Tyler's wife ran the blockade. He had one son who was the registrar of the Confederacy. He was a Confederate congressman. And this was given to his family. He also had 5 grandchildren that were in the Confederate Army. You will see books in this room that belong to President Tyler and from my family homes in South Carolina. Mount Willing, the Balknight Ferry Place, and Mulberry Hill Plantation, and Pine House Plantation, all in Edgefield County. The portrait above the mantel is of my grandfather's brother. He was in the Confederate Army, and he was a lieutenant, I think, maybe captain. I'm not sure. Someone who knows more about rank will have to tell me that. But his name was Jacob Ryden Balknight, and he fought with Wade Hampton in South Carolina, and he came to Virginia to assist in the Battle of Malvern Hill, where he was mortally wounded. Immediately beneath him is a bust of John C. Calhoun, another South Carolinian. Since I'm a South Carolinian, I put them there to keep each other company so they really wouldn't get lonely in the Gray Room when the Gray Lady came in. I would like to show you a portrait of Dr. Lyon Gardner Tyler, my husband's father. And this portrait was done when he was quite elderly. He had a 3rd son by his 2nd marriage when he was 81 years old, named Henry, who lived a very short time. But at that time, Dr. Tyler commissioned that his portrait be painted, and I think it was a very brilliant thing. I don't know too many 81-year-olds that have a small baby. Anyway, Dr. Tyler was president of the college in William and Mary for a substantial time.
I could see some genuine resemblance there, Harrison Tyler, between you and your relative who was captured in oil. I'm going to stop you once again for just a second, and let's take a call from New Haven, Connecticut, who's been waiting.
Yes.
New Haven, go ahead.
Yes. I'm thinking of the recent family reunion at Monticello of the descendants of President Jefferson and his slave Sally Hemings.
There are many African Americans who share the surname Tyler. And my question is there any ongoing inquiry or investigation as to possible African American descendants of President Tyler through slavery?
Thank you. Harrison Tyler.
I'm sure there are inquiries going on, but I'm not aware of any. I'm not really aware of any real possibilities such as you mentioned. John Tyler had many slaves here at Sherwood Forest, but see, he died in 1862, and my grandmother left here in 1863, and the campaign of 1864, the soldiers, the Union, this was all Union territory. The slaves that were here were mostly dispersed. Many went to Hampton, so that when the family returned after the Civil War, there were literally none of the slaves here on the place anymore. So we really don't have history. The records, the courthouse records were destroyed, as were most of the records in the county because of the war. Many of the houses and homes were burned. So we really have little or no information from that period.
During the second half of our program, we'll be talking with Lori Bonbright, who is the curator at Sherwood Forest, and also Kay Tyler, who is the managing director here, about plantation life and also some of the research that's going on about the life and contributions of the African Americans. Thanks for that question. Let's return, first take a telephone call, then we'll return to Paney Tyler. Westfield, New Jersey.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I believe, technically speaking, Tyler is not even a citizen of the United States. As an official of the Confederate government, he died in 1862, and if nobody afterwards made application to have his citizenship restored, he's still technically a traitor and not an American citizen. I'd like to hear the comments on that.
Well, I'm going to ask you to talk about the politics of all that, Dr. Crapo, if you would.
Yes, I'm not sure about the accuracy of the caller's claim concerning John Tyler. I think that his citizenship would have been restored sort of in a general amnesty. And I think his wife, her citizenship was never challenged. She became an active American citizen after the defeat of the Confederacy. John Tyler, when Lincoln was elected, was quite upset. He saw Lincoln as someone who would stop the expansion of slavery. And for John Tyler, that was crucial, the ability for the slave states to continue to expand. And as I think Harrison, or perhaps one of your lead-ins mentioned, he was part of a peace conference in February of 1861. He attempted to forge a compromise that would prevent civil war. He was unsuccessful. And he then left the peace conference, came to Virginia, and participated in the convention that debated secession. And he was appalled at the suggestion of some Western Virginians, those that ultimately formed the state of West Virginia, when they spoke out against expansion, and they found no difficulty in accepting the limitations on the expansion of slavery. That angered John Tyler a great deal, and then he voted for secession. And as the caller mentioned, he was a member of the Confederate Congress. I guess technically a traitor in that sense, but I don't think his citizenship is challenged today, nor that of his family.
Charlestown, New Hampshire. Go ahead, caller.
Hi. I was wondering, does your family still hold the same ideal as your grandfather did?
Well, what do you mean by that?
I mean, as far as what he believed in.
Are you thinking of specific things that you've learned that he believes in, or are you asking a general question?
Well, in general is to, like what the president has been involved in lately.
Thanks. Harrison Tyler, can you work with that question for the caller?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but my grandfather was a believer in states' rights, but he was a Jeffersonian Democrat. He believed in the Constitution. He believed in in your word, that if you gave your word that you were to do, supported something or would do something, that you always stuck by it. He stuck to his ideals. He never wavered. He never listened to public opinion as such and changed his thoughts because of public opinion. I think perhaps, and certainly I hope I espouse those ideals. I think that maybe that answers the question.
Thank you for that. We'll return to Painey Tyler, who is helping us understand a little bit more about the home, Sherwood Forest, and let's continue with our tour.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I might have the privilege of addressing one of the questions which remained unanswered from the gentleman who asked about Tyler's not being a citizen of the United States. His citizenship, as with those who were members of the Confederacy, were totally reinstated in 1927. The federal government erected a major monument to him in Hollywood Cemetery, Mammoth and Ansem, in the city of Richmond. And his birthday is celebrated by the federal government on March the 29th every year with the commandant of the closest military installation and soldiers marching and a memorial in honor of the 10th president. I hope that answers that question. From here, we are in the drawing room. We will proceed to the ballroom, which was added to the house between 1845 and 1847. It was built by local laborers. If you look at the woodwork here on the wall, you will see that it's a great deal cruder than the rest of the plantation woodwork because it was done by local laborers on the plantation. The curtains are green because Julia Gardner wanted to bring the, as she said, bring the color of the grass and the outside into the house. When she arrived, it was being made, built, and the ceiling was being made flat, and she had it arched, and according to a letter from her mother, to her mother, she said, "It doth better carry the sound of music." This room is 68 feet long, and it's 12.5 feet wide, and it was designed specifically for a dance called the Virginia Reel, and it's a little bit like London Bridge is falling down, and we have some people here who are very kindly going to dance the Virginia Reel in the ballroom at Sherwood Forest and show you President John Tyler's favorite dance.
Now your partner. Right hand round. Left hand round. Both hands round. Do-si-do. Lead couple, sashay. Turn your partner by the right arm. Next couple by the left. Come on back to the top. And lead your lines around. Bow to your partner. Right hand round. Left hand round. Both hands round. Do-si-do. Lead couple, sashay. Turn your partner by the right arm. Next couple by the left. Come on, back to the top. Lead your lines around. Bow to your partner.
And our thanks to the folks at Sherwood Forest for demonstrating the Virginia Reel. We'll be back after just a short break to learn more. About an hour and 10 minutes to go with the presidency of John Tyler. You're looking at a picture of Sherwood Forest, the home of John Tyler, our nation's 10th president, as C-SPAN continues its American President's Life Story series. Week 10 of 41 weeks as we continue to explore the lives of the American presidents. But we are back live here. We have a little more than an hour plus to go, and three guests here who know this president well. Two of his descendants, Harrison Tyler, his grandson, and Painey Tyler, who is Harrison Tyler's wife, and they are the folks who have restored and live in this home and have made it open to the public, and also Dr. Edward Crapole, who is history professor at the College of William and Mary, the school that's nearby to us here in Virginia's Tidewater, and also John Tyler's alma mater. We're going to return to telephone calls as we hear your questions about our 10th president. Here's how you phone in. The numbers are on the bottom of the screen. 202-624-1111 for you in the eastern half of the United States. 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones. Harrison Tyler, I'm going to ask you if you can at all give us a sense. I know it's hard with someone long dead, but how tall was John Tyler? What did he look like? And can you give us any sense of how he might have sounded compared to folks who live here today?
Well, John Tyler was 6 feet 2. He was thin and angular, which I'm not sure that I'm not. But he was generally in very good health, and of course lived until he was 72 years old. He played the fiddle. He played a number of musical instruments. He wrote poetry. He composed poetry, particularly to his wife, to both wives. He was married first to Letitia Christian, and she was the daughter of.
I think we don't have your microphone on. We're going to have to, as you're talking, keep going ahead, and we can hear you from other mics in the room. We'll get you adjusted there.
Then where were we at?
You were talking about Letitia?
Yes. He had 8 children by Letitia Christian, and he lived in his family home at Greenway for a good part of that time.
Have any sense, we can hear a bit of the Tidewater accent as you speak. You have any sense of what people might have sounded like in the mid-1800s here?
The Elizabethan English, I think people that grew up on the James River had the Elizabethan English dialect. You hear it in some areas in Canada today. Virginia, by and large, was settled by Cavaliers. They were supporters of Charles I. And when Cromwell came to power in England in the 1840s, many of Charles's supporters came to America and settled in Virginia and brought their particular type of dialect. My mother used to say "gyarden" for garden and "kyar" for car. I don't hear that really. Oh, I did hear somebody from Canada that used that same pronunciation. Out the house is, of course, strictly Tidewater, Virginia, and I still use that. I say out the house.
Dr. Crapole, you have some thoughts on the language of the period?
Not the language. I wanted to give some information on John Tyler as a president and as a host. He apparently in the White House was very gracious, had very elegant manners. He was able to charm most people. There's an account of Charles Dickens visiting the White House in 1842. It was at a time when John Tyler had made a number of appointments of ministers, and Dickens visited and was quite impressed with John Tyler and his manner, and thought he was a very fitting head of state in the United States, and he recorded as saying that it was a nice contrast to the members of the House of Representatives, many of whom were tobacco spitters, And John Tyler would never have stooped to such ill manners as that.
Our set is in what is a family room now of the home. It was at one time John Tyler's bedroom. Is that correct, this room?
Yes, yes it was.
And we are in an area of the house which is not open for public tour very often because this home is lived in by John Tyler's descendants. His grandson and family have lived here and helped to restore the place and now open it so that you can see it. Let's return to telephone calls on John Tyler. Raleigh, North Carolina, you're on the air.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank C-SPAN for this programming and also for providing free literature to teachers. This is the kind of program that our kids need to see, and hopefully those materials be used for benefit. My question, I actually have two questions for the panel. First of all, obviously John Tyler is pro-slavery. What would the treatment of his slaves have been at Sherwood Forest, maybe some of their daily activities, and what life would have been for them? And secondly, what was his views and dealings with Native Americans as well? I'll hang up and listen. Thanks.
Thank you. Harrison Tyler, you said you have some Native American roots. Can you take that second question?
Well, I'm descended from Pocahontas. There were not that many Indians living here in the county during that time frame because most of them had been displaced. So I really have no knowledge of his views or relations to Native Americans. As far as he never was really strongly pro-slavery, his view was that America needed to expand, particularly westward, as he put it, from sea to shining sea. The big issue of the day was whether the new states were to be slave states or not. His view was that it didn't matter, that would take it, that slaves would probably be freed in time, and that it was just not an issue as far as his politics and expansion was concerned. We have very little information because, as I mentioned, my family left here in 1863 and did not really return until 1869. The slaves that were here were dispersed. I'm not aware that any of them actually took the last name of Tyler, but as you know that slaves did not have last names, so when they became free, they took whatever name that suited them. And very often they would take planters or people that they knew and adopted those names, and there are a number of Tylers here in the county today and elsewhere as well.
Susan, I'd like to speak to the question of his views on Native Americans, on Indians. Tyler, while president, did settle a ongoing war with the Seminoles in Florida, and in 1842 that war was settled, and John Tyler was proud of that he had achieved a peace. He sought, in terms of the way he viewed Native Americans, he wanted them treated with justice, but he also had a very paternalistic viewpoint. He looked upon them as people that had to be guided and educated and so on. In terms of any legacy, he really wasn't in office long enough to have a legacy concerning Native Americans. In terms of slavery, John Tyler was opposed to the slave trade. He also spoke out against auctions of slaves in D.C. in the area of around Washington. He wanted to outlaw that. However, he never manumitted any of his own slaves. He never sought any amelioration of slavery. And I think in the end, as I mentioned before, in terms of the secession crisis, he ended up being a supporter of the peculiar institution of slavery.
And thank you for your first comment on using these materials with students. People like the Tylers and Dr. Krapel, who spend a good deal of time and energy preserving history, I think it's fair to say do that with the hope that young people will learn more about American history. And so we are also working to provide as many materials as possible for schools during our American President series. We have a website that is available for teachers, and we have teachers' kits and information that you can receive from the whole series, and you can reach C-SPAN two ways: on the web at cspan.org/classroom, or you can telephone and ask for materials. The number is 202-626-4858. 202-626-4858. That number is for teachers exclusively so that you can receive more information about teaching with the American President series. Well, one of the other projects we've been involved in is talking to young people about American presidents connected in some way with the President of the Week. Since it is John Tyler Week, let's introduce you by telephone to Paul West, who is from Tyler, Texas. We've already talked about the town of Tyler a few times this morning, and is a sophomore at John Tyler High School. Paul West, good morning.
Hi there.
Can you tell us a fact or two that you know about John Tyler?
I learned that he was the first president to have his veto overridden, and that he promised he would not run for president again if the Democrats would support the annexation of Texas.
And how important is that whole second point to you as a Texan?
It's very important because in the 1840s, when the annexation of Texas was brought up, the politicians were pushing that to the side because they didn't want to bring up the issues of slavery. But he brought that issue to a forefront and forced people to deal with it, which led to Texas becoming a state.
Can you tell me, as someone who lives in the city of Tyler, Texas, attending a high school named after the president, did anyone really, or what time in your life did anyone really make the connection for you with our 10th president?
That probably happened shortly after I moved here about 5 years ago.
Are there any statues of John Tyler in town?
I think there might be something downtown. I'm not quite sure.
Do you, as someone who's done a bit of studying of this president, do you have questions for our guests?
Yes, I do. I've got several questions. How many do you want me to ask for?
Well, why don't you give us up to 3?
Okay. I read about a lot of stuff about how John Tyler had a large feud with Henry Clay, and I was wondering what sparked that feud. And,
all right. Why don't you just move down the line and we'll take them all at once.
Okay, and why was he against Andrew Jackson's politics? And my final question is, if John Tyler was impeached and convicted, would Congress try to use impeachment as a means to control the office of the presidency in the future?
Now, can you tell us, let me make sure I have the third Congress question. If he had been impeached and convicted, would Congress have what?
Tried to use impeachment as a means to control the office of the presidency.
All right. What will you do with this information? What's your next step in your study?
I've gotten interested about John Tyler, and I'm going to read up more and go more into depth on different his political beliefs and political policies, and just read more and find out more information that I didn't know about him.
How does history fit into your life?
It plays a fairly good major portion of my life because I enjoy history and learning about what happened and how, I guess, things came to be. Especially, I just really got interested recently about how John Tyler really single-handedly played a major portion in bringing Texas into the Union.
Well, Paul West, thank you. At this point, we're going to let you go so you can return to your television set, and we'll get you answers to all 3 of your questions. And I want to thank you for your willingness to participate and also telling us a little more about the connection between Tyler, Texas, and this president. Well, if you wouldn't mind taking the impeachment question first, Dr. Krapel. The whole thing, I guess, is really the legacy of the institution or the constitutional powers of impeachment. It was a speculative question, but perhaps you can take it on for the student.
Yes, it was a speculative question. I think the fact that he was not impeached is really quite important in that it was just brooded about and not in fact acted upon. Because from the viewpoint of someone like Tyler, he while he had been a defender of the legislative branch and had questions about executive power that speaks to his question about Jackson. He thought Jackson was too strong a president and was abusing the executive. But in the case of impeachment, I think Tyler and others would wish to stave that off. I don't think that we would want impeachment to be practiced during every presidency and as a form of congressional control over the executive branch. And in Tyler's case, when he was president, he in some ways reversed his previous position. He had been the defender of the legislative branch, and as president he used the power of the executive to strengthen the presidency. And even though he faced a good deal of opposition and was burned in effigy, as I mentioned before, he did stave off any impeachment efforts. I don't think it's, to answer the question directly, as an historian, I think that it's a good thing he was not impeached. I think it's a good thing he was not thrown out of office after a trial. I don't think that that would be good for our system. I think that impeachment should be something of last resort and for very serious crimes or misdemeanors, and not something used in a partisan way by a political party to chastise a president.
Harrison Tyler, you have some additional thoughts, I'm sure, for Paul West, our student, on his views and relationship with Andrew Jackson.
Well, John Tyler objected to Andrew Jackson because he was using the office of president for what John Tyler considered personal gain or for his cronies. And so that John Tyler objected to that very much and actually left the Democratic Party and became a Whig because of that.
First question asked by the student was the large feud with Henry Clay. What was the source of it?
Well, Harrison has touched upon this earlier. It stems from the 1840 election. I think Henry Clay assumed that he would control Harrison, first of all, and set himself up to be the candidate of the Whigs in 1844. Henry Clay very much wanted to be president.
How many times did he try?
Well, he tried a number of times, but in terms of actual near success, it came in 1844. He lost narrowly to Polk, and he believed, I think, to some degree that Tyler had played a role in that, in his defeat. But the feud really stemmed from the fact that Clay assumed that Tyler would be pliant, that he could control him once Harrison had died. And John Tyler, as I mentioned, I think at the opening of the program, took a very decisive stand and indicated he was going to be the president. He was not going to be dictated to by Henry Clay. And as a consequence, Henry Clay became very embittered, and Tyler and Clay had been friends earlier. And there was a running feud during his presidency, and I think that led to Tyler not having a party. I mean, he is disassociated from the Whigs as a consequence. One of the more recent biographers of Henry Clay, a historian named Robert Remini, has argued, in fact, in terms of this feud, that it was really Henry Clay who was the major source of it, that Tyler was willing to compromise, that he was willing to go along with certain things, but had to be respected as president and had to be respected as the chief executive.
We are at Sherwood Forest, John Tyler's home. It's about 30 miles away from Richmond, the state capital, about 20 from Williamsburg, site of William and Mary, his alma mater, and Dr. Krapel's academic home now. Let's take a telephone call as we talk about our 10th president from San Francisco.
Yes, good morning. Congratulations to C-SPAN on this wonderful series.
Thank you. We're learning a lot as well.
Yes, so am I. My name is Mike. I'm calling from San Francisco, and first of all, I wanted to note that Tyler was indeed the first president ever photographed by none other than Matthew Brady in his New York studio. Secondly, I had read some about the Tyler's children serving in the Civil War, and since Sherwood Forest probably has the distinction, if you can call it that, of being the only house ever ransacked, president's house ransacked by Union troops. What was it like for the family to come back to Sherwood Forest? And secondly, I wonder if Mr. Tyler might address his restoration of a Civil War fort. Sounds fascinating.
Thank you. Can you talk about the family returning here?
Yes, I can. A very poignant letter from Julia to her mother, I think, explains what happened greatly here during that period. I think that everyone left the plantation, and when Julia returned home, she was sitting on the north porch one morning, And she writes that daily straggling soldiers returning from the war were coming up to her front door, and she saw two particularly disreputable-looking soldiers coming home in rags and tatters with their hair down to their shoulders and great full beards, and they frightened her. They were such large men, and they were not clean. So she called someone in to come to the front porch with her to greet them, and when they walked up to the porch, she said, "You cannot come in the house, but we will give you bread and water, for this is all we have to eat." And one of the young men said, "Mother, don't you know who we are?" And they were her two sons that had fought in the Confederate Army, and they had been called out as students from the Battle of Newmarket, and they were at Washington College, and this was the first time she'd seen them. They had grown from young, skinny, little fragile teenagers into full-grown, hefty men. I think that that one of those children always bore the scars of the war. He wrote a letter. This is Judge David Gardner Tyler. As he went into battle, he was standing by his roommate, whose head was shot off by a cannonball and flew into his chest. And he grabbed the head and fell to the ground and attempted to put the head back on the young man's shoulders. Then he held him in his arms and he cried. And throughout his life, he referred to his experiences in battle and the horrors of the situation of returning here and attempting to re-establish a working plantation as it had been prior to the war. And I think that rather than growing crops, they resorted to growing timber in many instances. As I ride horseback through the forest, I can see the furrows where once there were fields.
The other question was a bit about your restoration of the fort.
Well, 2.5 miles east of Richmond is a Union fort which was built in May of 1864. For two purposes. It's right at a sharp bend in the river where the deep water swings in close to the North Shore, so that Union ships going up the river could come under easy musket fire or cannon fire from any Confederate that was there on the bank. So the fort was built to protect a narrow point and also to fan out and pacify the countryside. The fort was built by the USCT, the U.S. Colored Troops, under the direction of General Edward A. Wild. It was attacked 2.5 weeks later, on May the 24th, by Confederate cavalry under Fitzhugh Lee. The Confederate cavalry were repulsed with heavy losses. I'm having our third reenactment of this attack this coming weekend, May the 23rd, which is the closest Sunday to the original attack.
How many people are you expecting?
We have over 200 reenactors that are coming. The 54th Massachusetts from Washington are coming to represent the USCT. As they say, they have more members signed up for this event than they have for any other event they've ever attended. The 3rd Pennsylvania Light Artillery are coming to represent the artillery groups that were in the fort. We have several cannon. We have the 1st Texas Confederate forces, who are primarily near Williamsburg, are coming to be the main Confederate representatives, along with the 44th Virginia, the 3rd Virginia, the 16th Virginia, and numerous others. And we're going to have a big cookout. We're going to have a parade of ladies. We're going to have a cavalry demonstration, and we're going to have fun for everybody.
Now, people must be wondering, is history your vocation? Is this how you make your living, or is it an avocation for you?
Well, I am a chemist and chemical engineer, and I have a chemical water treatment company, but I am selling the water treatment company to my employees, and am slowly turning to my real love, which is, yes, history. I had never paid much attention to history until recent years, but now it is my focus. The rest of the fort is a very important part of it. The house here and maintaining this home in the family for future generations is probably the biggest single focus of my life now.
New York City, you're next on John Tyler.
Good morning. Your series is a wonderful series, and I'd like your guest view to my statements and my extrapolation, if I may. The states' rights was the primary issue in American history prior to the Civil War. It had to do with the economy, agriculture and trade versus manufacturing, with slavery a part issue in the economy, and foreign policy, trade with Europe, sectionalism, and the idea of manifest destiny. My extrapolation is this, that generally Southern Democrats champion the idea of states' rights. Now, the irony and the interesting point that I'm trying to make is that the idea of power to states and local communities regarding allocations of federal funds is now championed by the party of the Union forces, the present-day Republican Party. Am I totally exaggerating the point, or is there some analogy?
I think you're correct. I think there is some analogy. Actually, in the post-Civil War period, the Republican Party favored a nationalist approach. They were big supporters of tariff and internal improvements, funding for railroads, merchant marine, and so on. And if anything, it's the Republican Party that sort of moved from its previous position of a good deal of federal intervention in the economy to the position they have today. So I think the caller has an interesting point.
Riverside, California, on John Tyler.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. I'm calling. I'm a little troubled by the sort of negative comments about President Tyler. It's sort of a judgment of a man of an earlier age by the standards of a present day. In 1840, the United States was very much concerned with its own internal development. My ancestry is transmontane, and we did not have a lot of liking for the people from the Tidewater. But at that time, I believe that the President of the United States was rather minor, not a minor office, but an office that was charged under the constitutional oath to faithfully discharge the and execute the laws of the United States. And it seems to me that John Tyler did an excellent job of that. The president in those days was not the president we have today, nor was he the president in the days of Washington when they were setting up what the United States would be. I think it was about the same time that de Tocqueville was making his tour of the United States.
Well, thanks, and an important question. What really was the function of the presidency in this period of history?
Well, I think the caller is correct. The presidency then was not the presidency we know today, and the growth of executive power has increased greatly in the 20th century, particularly. So I think that in the case of Tyler, when he became president, he, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of his opposition to Jackson, he had felt that Jackson had used the executive power to the detriment of the Congress, and he reacted against that. But when he was president, I think he did try to enhance the power of the president, which I think he did by setting the precedent concerning the vice president, becoming the full president upon the death of an incumbent. I think he also enhanced the power of the president in terms of foreign policy. But again, nothing like what the power of a president today. As far as the negative comments about Tyler, I think perhaps the caller misunderstood that that's the image that historians have of John Tyler. They're very critical of John Tyler, and I, for one, would try to correct that and say that his accomplishments were fairly significant. I wouldn't say he was a great president, but he was a good president.
Harrison Tyler has mentioned his interest, and his wife's interest in this home being preserved by future generations of Tylers and available to the public. And we've talked about the fact that this is open to the public. Here's one of the brochures of Sherwood Forest. The woman who is responsible for directing the day-to-day operations of this place joins us next. Her name is Kay Tyler, and she, along with Lori Bonbright, join us. Ms. Bonbright is the curator here. And Kay Tyler, I'd like to start with you as we now get a view of the outside. We haven't talked of any of the operations. Could you tell us how many visitors you get each year and how much it costs to come through, all those sorts of things?
Well, we get a good number of visitors because of our distance from Williamsburg. We're only 30 minutes from Williamsburg, which is convenient for us. And we probably, last year we got about 30,000 visitors. So we've been here for, of course, Mrs. Tyler, my mother-in-law, and my boss, has been having tours of Sherwood Forest since the 1970s. So I've had that luxury of having the house established, of course. 6 years ago, on President Tyler's birthday, on his 203rd birthday, we opened the house for daily visitation. So that has allowed more access to the house.
What are the hours?
The hours are 9 to 5 every day. Last tour's at 5, and every day except for Christmas and Thanksgiving. So we're committed to having the house open and accessible.
And the cost for visiting?
$8.50 for adults, $5.50 for students, and we do have the traditional discounts for seniors and AAA, military, things such as that.
I want to give a telephone number out, and today many of the folks who work and live here are involved with this production. So if you get a tape, try again, but here is the number, and we'll give it out again. 804 is the area code in this part of the country, 829-5377. You'll learn more information about this place and also the gift shop, because the gift shop has a number of books about John Tyler and about the period, cookbooks, artifacts, all sorts of things. And if you are interested, one of those folks who likes to have a little piece of a place for yourself, it's 804-829-5377. And Kay Tyler, I was there yesterday and asked the woman who was working behind the counter what was the most popular item. She said you sell more cookbooks than anything else.
Well, we do. We have a particular cookbook that, fortunately, Mrs. Tyler wrote, and it is a guidebook on the Virginia presidential homes, which is a nice guidebook as well as, of course, a cookbook. And so that's been a very popular item.
And you have a website?
We do, www.sherwoodforest.org, which my husband put together for us, so we're very fortunate. It is a family-owned business. And so I encourage everybody to do that, and you can access my email. And please encourage questions to me about things you might have seen today.
Well, thank you for that. I'm sure people will take advantage of it. www.sherwoodforest, all one word, .org, and the phone number once again, 804-829-5377. Lori Bonbright, we have had a number of questions as the program progressed, and I've been deferring them, knowing that you could tackle this. Talk to us about plantation life at Sherwood Forest. We've had a number of callers wanting to know about labor pool here, what the crops were, what life was like, what conditions were like. So take it away, if you will.
Okay. Well, plantation life here, when we're looking at President Tyler and looking at Sherwood Forest, we're looking at a plantation that is on the eve of the Civil War. We're looking late into the period of slavery in the South, and looking at a plantation that's changed over time. This region was settled very, very early on, back in the 17th century. As a tobacco plantation, we actually have some buildings here that survived from that period. We have a wonderful building. It was a tobacco barn when it was originally built. During President Tyler's day, he used it as a wine house, actually. They were making wine here on the property. And other period buildings that do survive, the smokehouse. Plantations were self-sufficient, so there were a lot of different activities going on in the plantation and many people involved. President Tyler owned a really changing number of slaves, anywhere between 60 and 90 slaves during his period here. And the crops have really evolved during President Tyler's period. As the plantations in this area were originally settled as tobacco plantations. In fact, the whole Tidewater region is quite famous for tobacco. But by the early 19th century, tobacco had really exhausted the soil, and they started turning to other crops. And corn and wheat were the most popular crops during that period, although President Tyler was experimenting with some other crops, including, we know, potatoes, perhaps cotton in this region. And they were doing a lot of reading and research. In fact, Edmund Ruffin, who was living just up the river, was a friend of President Tyler's and was doing a lot of research into different, more modern agricultural methods. And Tyler was experimenting with different fertilization techniques. So the landscape here would have been a bit different than we see today. We see the forests around the home today, but you would have seen many more fields of corn and wheat growing. And you would have seen the laborers working in the fields. You would have seen a large community here of people, and that also included a free black labor pool from the neighboring area. from the Ruthville area. You had free black laborers coming here to work, so it was a very wide community. We also had people working in the home. We would have had house servants, perhaps up to 10 house servants, including a housekeeper. We know Catherine Wing was an Irish housekeeper who came down from New York. She was sent by Julia's mother to help with the children, with the housekeeping. So there was a lot of activity going on here.
Can you, from any of the study that you've done, can you answer a viewer's question about conditions? Do we know anything of how the Tylers treated those who worked for them?
We don't know that much. We wish we knew more. What we know survives from letters, and it really appears to be a rather quiet time. People seem to actually get along quite well here, all the different variety of people that were working here. There are not, a lot of records of things like runaways or things like that here. It was a rather quiet, rather congenial life here. We know, while we don't have a lot of the surviving structures of houses that people lived in, we actually have a wonderful building that Mrs. Tyler moved to the property. It was reconstructed. It was a building that was set to be demolished, a slave house from a neighboring plantation that was moved here and reconstructed, so that we're able to see a surviving example of that. But life here seemed to be rather quiet. People seem to get along pretty well here.
Kay Tyler, how many acres do you have?
1,600 acres came with President Tyler's purchase with the house. 50 surrounding acres with the house proper, but Mr. and Mrs. Tyler do own a significant additional portion of the Tyler estate, which is not continuous per se. There are other Tyler families in this county and in Charles City County, which we're fortunate to have, and so much of the 1,600 acres is still intact with those Tyler family members. And I might add, if I could, about the conditions, and refer readers, viewers to read a book called Ann Tyler II, which was written by Dr. Robert Seeger in 1963. However, it is an excellent resource it's out of print, but it's an excellent resource and does address some of the conditions and observers' views, letters of visitors to President Tyler and the conditions that they observed, especially since there were several New York visitors from Julia Gardner's family. I think there was some concern about that even in that day, and they did address some of those. And as Lori mentioned, it seemed to be a very quiet setting. So.
You mentioned earlier that Charles City County is now 70% African American, and there are a number of people working on research of the history of the period, especially regarding African Americans. And here's one of the brochures you can get locally: 4 Centuries of Black History in Charles City County, which is a project of a number of the plantations in the area. Right. So much history here if you come to visit. Thank you. We've got a few callers waiting. We're going to take a telephone call from Borrego Springs, California.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Yes,
welcome.
Hi. I'm calling for Penny and her lovely husband. I met them at a social function, and their lovely daughter, Julia, over in the Rancho Santa Fe area. And Julia was in costume. And I wondered if they would ever consider seminars for some of the children out here who don't know a great deal about that part of the country.
Not only consider it, but be absolutely delighted to do it. Harrison, I have a cousin who lives in La Jolla, and her daughter has invited Harrison. That's Craig McClellan, who incidentally is a great nephew of General McClellan, who was here at Sherwood Forest during the war between the states, just to show that the North and the South have reconciled. This is my cousin's husband, Susan McClellan, in La Jolla. He's a lawyer, and so Harrison has lectured in their daughter's school upon occasion, and he's very good at doing this. And yes, we would be delighted in any way that we can to contribute to the knowledge of the younger people about what happened in the 19th century here in Virginia.
I might recommend that you talk to Kay Tyler, whom you just met on camera as the managing director here and responsible for helping people with the history. And again, the telephone number here, 804-829-5377. Little Rock, Arkansas is next. Good morning.
Good morning. I apologize if you've already addressed this question. I missed the first 15 minutes of today's show. I'm off on Mondays and try never to miss this. Have you talked about the slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too? I have forgotten from my history what this was in reference to.
Go ahead, Harrison.
Well, William Henry Harrison was most famous for his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he defeated the coalition of Indians led by Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief. And it became the political cry, Tippecanoe, and I think, as Dr. Crapo mentioned earlier, they had great difficulty in selecting a vice president because the Whig Party was divided in three factions. There was Daniel Webster, the northern faction, Henry Clay, the middle faction, and John C. Calhoun, the third faction. John Tyler was one of the few people who nobody objected to, so he was, I think, was an important reason why he was selected as the vice president, and their campaign slogan became Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Del Mar, California.
I'd like to ask the professor, since there was no vice president and you said there was some impeachment process, who was the Speaker of the House? I'm a little surprised that a vice president wasn't crucial if that was taking place, because wouldn't the Speaker of the House be the president had he been impeached? And it was my impression that William Henry Harrison was opposed to the expansion of slave states, and so it sounds like Tyler felt the opposite, and so it was sort of interesting that Harrison did pick him as his vice president. And just one last question for Mr. Tyler, if he would describe his lineage from Pocahontas. Thank you.
Thank you. If their views were opposite, why did Harrison choose him?
I don't think it was really a matter of Harrison choosing Tyler. I think that, as this Harrison Tyler has made clear, he was a compromise candidate, and he was seen as someone who could bring in the Southern vote. And the question of Tyler not appointing a vice president, or the Congress dealing with that question, we've talked a lot about impeachment, but it really was never a serious threat. I mean, it was just talk, and so it never reached the stage where people would start to worry about who would succeed Tyler. And so
Do you know who the Speaker of the House was at the time?
No, I don't
I
offhand.
think it was a Virginian, and perhaps if we have the information, we can pass it along. I was looking at a book this morning with with the officers at the time, and I can't give you the name, but we've got it at C-SPAN, and maybe we can pass that along. Thanks for that question. Pocahontas.
Well, I'm descended from Pocahontas through the Randolphs. My mother's mother was a Harrison, whose great-grandmother was a Randolph, and Pocahontas's great-granddaughter married Colonel Robert Bowling, and their son, John Bowling, had a son, their son, John Bowling, had 7 children, and I'm descended from Jane Bowling, who married Richard Randolph.
Next call is from Batavia, New York, on John Tyler. Good morning.
Good morning. This is the most wonderful 66th birthday present to talk to you all, because C-SPAN is so important to me. I started off with book notes. I was reading in a book called The Words We Live By, which was on book notes, and so I tuned in a little late for this program. I was visiting there, and I met Laurie Bonbright, and I was very impressed by the place. Did you all mention why it's called Sherwood Forest? And thank you so much for this whole program. It's just wonderful. Thank you. Bye.
Well, thank you, and happy birthday to you, calling in on your birthday. Would you explain, we did at the beginning, but for people who joined in progress, the name Sherwood Forest comes from?
I believe it came from Henry Clay, who, as I think we have been told, was not an exact admirer of Tyler's, and it was very definitely vice versa. And when Tyler retired from the presidency, Henry Clay, I believe this was published in a Washington paper, or he was heard to say, "Thank God that old outlaw John Tyler, like Robin Hood, is retiring to his Sherwood Forest." It was a pun, it was an insult. However, Tyler loved it, and he proceeded to change the name of this house from Walnut Grove to Sherwood Forest.
If you want to visit the area, if you've got vacation time and no plans, a lot of history in this part of the country. If you're driving, or rather flying into Washington, D.C., it's about 2.5 hours south down 95, and then on to historic Route 5 to find Sherwood Forest and also Harrison's home, which is just up the street from here, and Williamsburg, another 20 miles south, so southeast. If you're interested in history, we've got lots of it for you in this Tidewater section of Virginia. Louisville, Kentucky. Good morning, you're on the air.
Hello, yes. I had a question. Is there a website or someone I can contact in reference to the family genealogy of the Tylers? My family descended from the Tylers. President Tyler's sister, I believe, was Elizabeth. Is that correct?
Thanks. In a few minutes, you're going to meet the gentleman who's working on the website for the family. So if you don't mind, we'll hold that question, and he can tell you about what you can find on the website. Thanks. I've heard from a couple of other Tyler relatives. Not surprising, since John Tyler had the most children of any president, 15 in total. You told us earlier you had a reunion with about 200 people?
Yes, about 200.
I think we found a few more for you this morning, Mr. Tyler.
All of those people at the reunion were about 6'2", with dark hair and dark eyes and a nose with a little point in it.
Recognized where they came from. Chico, California. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I have had in my possession from my great-great-grandfather a poster that says it has a picture of Harrison, and it says underneath Harrison-1840, and underneath that it says Tippecanoe and his grandson too, and then under that it says all ye young voters of the year 1840 are cordially invited to rally at the log cabin 1009 4th Street in Sacramento Town on Thursday, July 19th at 1 o'clock past meridian for the purpose of reorganizing under the Harrison banner. And under that it says C.E. Burnham, Secretary, and on the other side J.O. Coleman, Chairman. And under that it says Sacramento, California in 1888.
And what's your question about it?
Well, I just wondered if what that was about, because I have no information.
Thank you. Dr. Krapel, can you help with that?
I wouldn't know either exactly what. I'd have to see it and have a sense of whether it related to, I assume it related to 1888 and an attempt to...
Well, it was 1840, she said, that was the date.
Didn't she say something?
It was dated 1888 is what she said.
Yeah.
But I might mention that when William Henry Harrison was selected by the Whig Party to run for president, that they pictured him as being born in a log cabin because he was a soldier in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois in the Ohio territories, or the Indiana territories they were called. However, he was actually born at the beautiful Berkeley Plantation in Virginia, but part of his campaign was picturing him as being born in a log cabin.
I think I now understand what this relates to. Benjamin Harrison was the Republican candidate for president in 1888, and that's the reference.
The grandson.
Yeah, that's right. And he was a successful candidate against Grover Cleveland in 1888, and so this poster probably was an organizational meeting for Republicans to support Benjamin Harrison in 1888.
John Tyler was 72 years old when he died. He is buried in Richmond at the Hollywood Cemetery. We have some video next to show you of what his gravesite looks like, and perhaps I could ask the Tylers to talk a little bit about John Tyler's gravesite, if you would.
Well, I'd like to tell the story of his death. That John Tyler had opposed Virginia seceding from the Union, and had strongly opposed it for a period of time, until he realized that there was going to be no compromise between the Northerners and the Southerners, and then he did vote for secession and was elected to the Confederate Congress. The Confederate Congress was to convene in Richmond in January of 1862. John Tyler left here, Sherwood Forest, to go to Richmond to take his seat. The family was to join him a few days later. But that night, my grandmother had a dream in which she pictured John Tyler in a bed with carved eagle wings on the head, deathly pale, holding out his arms and calling her name. And she was so alarmed that the next morning she gathered the children together and took the next boat, because that was the main transportation to Richmond, to go to Richmond to see how he was. And she arrived in Richmond that evening, went to the Exchange Hotel where the Confederate Congress was convening, saw John Tyler. He looked very healthy, retired to their room. Now, she liked to sleep late in the morning, and so it was probably later in the morning when she awoke and found that John Tyler was not in the room with her. Someone was beating on the door saying, "Come quickly." She threw on a gown, ran down the hall, and there in a room was John Tyler in a bed, deathly pale, with his arms outstretched, calling her name, and there were carved eagle wings on the head of the bed.
You can visit the Tyler gravesite, both Julia Gardner and John Tyler. And is Letitia buried there as well?
No, Letitia is buried at her family home in New Kent County.
It is a public cemetery and open for you to visit if you are doing a gravesite tour of American presidents. Spring, Texas, on John Tyler.
Oh, hello, thank you, and I just want to let you know that this is a wonderful show. Earlier you had a call about the Speaker of the House, and according to my resources here, the Speaker of the House was John Winston Jones of Virginia. He was elected December 4th, 1843. And if anybody's interested, there's a real good book out there called Presidential Fact Book by Joseph Nathan Kane. And I'm not related to John Tyler. Just wanted to let you know that. But,
well, thank you.
I appreciate the show. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. And as always, our viewers are champs at all this. When we don't know things at the table, invariably someone will call us with the information. While we're talking about books, this is a biography of John Tyler that's available in the books, in the gift shop here at Sherwood Forest. And it is a biography written by Oliver Perry Chitwood, and it's available for sale at about $32. You are working on a book about John Tyler as well. When will it be available?
Well, I hope in a couple of years, 2 years. I'm still researching it. And
what's your focus?
My focus will be on John Tyler's role in American foreign relations. That's really how I became interested in John Tyler. But in doing the research for the book, I've become fascinated with this notion that this man, who was identified principally as a states writer and a champion of the Old South, was in fact someone who enhanced the role of the presidency, played an important role in making the executive position what it is today. And so one of my sub-themes is this notion of John Tyler setting precedents, certain precedents. We've talked about them this morning already, concerning Vice President taking over from the President, but more importantly in the realm of foreign policy concerning Hawaii, China, and the annexation of Texas.
We have about 15 more minutes in our discussion of our 10th President, John Tyler. Fayetteville, West Virginia is next.
Yes, David Sneed from Fayetteville, West Virginia.
Welcome, sir.
I've always been a great student of history, not an authority, but interested in American history. And I've been watching your series with great interest and enthusiasm. I commend you for the work you're doing with the presidential series. I have a couple of parallel questions, really. One goes back to the Jefferson moments. I, as a young lad, traveled through that country, and I remember in the late 40s or early 50s there was a little structure that looks like Shadwell in the original birth site location. The next time I traveled a few years later in that area, that building was no longer there. I don't know if it was original or if it was a reproduction of Shadwell. The other question I wanted to ask is with regards to Tyler's birthplace, which you've talked about today, but is there any move on the part of any group to try to obtain the birthplace for a National Historic Site, or as a part of the family's interest in the Tyler history, or is that a possibility? You mentioned it was in private hands, but I think it would be wonderful if a little replica of Shadwell could be reconstructed at Monticello, and if Conway birthplace could be obtained and put into use by the public, and to enjoy and to appreciate. Could you comment on that, the family or the professor there, either one?
Harrison Tyler?
Well, his birthplace was Greenway, and yes, it is a wonderful place, and it would be nice to have it as an historic monument. Perhaps you can furnish some money and we can get that accomplished.
Can you, anyone who is interested in this whole process, talk a little bit about what it's like to live in a historic spot where people tour?
I will address what it's like first to live in a historic spot. I like it. I've always lived in an historic spot. I was born on a plantation, and I don't think I've had a great transition. I'm still on a plantation. I think in this particular house, one must be acutely aware of your antecedents on the property. Certainly, as I look at the windows and how they are designed in the various rooms, and I know who designed them. As I look at the window valances, and I know that Julia Gardner had her mother send those down from New York. As I am working on the floor to try and restore certain parts of the floorboards, and I think, who in the world defaced this floor with these nail holes? And then the next day I read a letter and it's Julia saying, "Dear Mama, I'm nailing the rugs to the floor." You get an idea of definite continuity of one family and love of the home. Julia constantly expressed her love of this plantation. I have had any number of people that reside on the plantation that are absolutely convinced that they can hear everybody in the family speaking to them all night long, I almost being one of them. But I think that one is acutely aware of the preservation of an heritage when it has been bestowed upon you. And I think that if you have the opportunity to preserve this, then it is your obligation and your duty. And in particular, what is it like to share this with the American public? I think we should. I initially, when I first came here, had no intention of sharing it with the public. I was just as selfish as I could be, and I wanted to live here as I had always lived in a private home. However, I found that people knocked at my door. One day I was sunbathing in the garden, and I looked up, and there were 6 ladies with handbags peering down at me. And so I really decided the thing to do was to share it with the public, and it's been a very successful venture. The concept of living in a house where part is open to the public and part is private, I find not difficult at all, because on a plantation, a house is always filled with people, and the grounds are filled with people of necessity for maintenance. So you really can't go outside in your house coat. You really have to be dressed when you walk out the door.
John Tyler served all but 1 month of a 4-year presidency because of the death of Harrison. He dearly wanted to be thought of well in history, but he said from the very beginning he would only seek 1 term, but he changed his mind. He really did make an effort along the way, didn't he?
Yes, he did. There's some dispute as to whether he really gave that commitment initially. He was advised to do that by his friends in Williamsburg to simply state he wouldn't run for a 2nd term, but I'm not sure he actually gave that commitment. And he, I think, wanted to be remembered well as president, and he did seek during his presidency, since he had no legislative program. I think that consequently his foreign policy was very important to his future ambitions. He wanted to be a successful, active president, and the book that Kay Tyler mentioned by Robert Seeger, which was published back in 1963, he shows very effectively that Tyler in 1843 and 44 did try to mount a separate third-party campaign. In the end, he was unsuccessful and essentially withdrew. I think he was criticized for that by some of his friends for being too ambitious. Some of his Virginia friends thought maybe he shouldn't have pursued that. But on that level, I think Tyler was more pragmatic, perhaps, as a politician than his friends wanted to grant.
The man who was successful in 1844, James Knox Polk, our next president on the 11th. And for those of you who are following the series, please note it is a Friday. We have to work with the sites on days that they're available. So it's Friday, May 28th, James K. Polk, our 11th president. We're going to take another call and then introduce you to a few more of John Tyler's descendants. Our call is from Jacksonville, Florida.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I found your program to be very informative. Mrs. Payne mentioned one of the children that was raised in the house as a Tazewell. Well, my father is named Norwood Tazewell Tyler. And I wanted to know if you know of any names of the other children that were raised in that home.
Thank you.
That's for me. I'm going to defer on this to Harrison. Out of 15 children, I do know the names. However, I certainly couldn't tell you all of their names right now, but Harrison probably can, as they are his aunts and his uncles.
The oldest, John Tyler, by his first marriage, his oldest child was Mary. His next child was Robert. Then there was John, then there was Julia, then there was Tazewell, and then there was Alice. Now, Tazewell and Alice were still young, and when John Tyler married Julia, they actually lived here with Julia, and Julia was very fond of both of them. Alice was quite pretty and had lots of suitors, and my grandmother worried about getting the proper suitor for her. Then, of course, she had 7 children, all of whom lived here. They were David Gardner, John Alexander, gosh, now my memory is...
Was it Lackland?
Lackland,
Fitzhugh,
Lyon, right. Fitzhugh, and finally Pearl Tyler, who was the baby.
15 is
That's impressive.
Impressive to remember.
She asked if Harrison knew anything about the Tazewell name. Do you know how
Tazewell is kind of a mystery, because after he grew up here, after the Civil War, he went to California, and I really don't think that we know what happened to Tazewell. He had been married, but he left his wife. I'm not aware that there are descendants today from Tazewell, but he went to California and kind of disappeared.
Well, this woman believes she's one of them, so perhaps we can reconnect.
I don't know.
Julia Gardner was extremely proud of her Gardner heritage, and she was rightfully so. Her ancestor was Lord Lyon Gardner of Gardner's Island, New York. Therefore, she named every one of her children Gardner as their middle name.
I was going to say that one of John Tyler's good friends was Littleton Waller Tazewell, and perhaps he named Tazewell for his friend.
A lot on genealogy, and this is an appropriate time to introduce you to a few more Tylers as we wrap up our program here. Let me begin with William Tyler, if I can, because we had a number of questions about the website at Sherwood Forest and whether or not there are any links to learn more about Tyler family genealogy. Can you tell us what you've got available there?
We have a page on the website that lists the first generation down below the children of John Tyler. And I think we have a couple of links to the other like presidential websites. The genealogy, Sherry Tyler is currently writing a book right now, and she organized the family reunion, and she's going to be a great source when the book comes out for the genealogy. So we've really got the first level down. Also, the Pocahontas book there's a book on the genealogy of Pocahontas, and many family members are listed in that also.
William Tyler, you and we met your wife Kay a little while ago. You're the next generation who are going to be deeply involved in this. What are your goals as this gradually passes over to your care?
Our goals are to maintain the house so that and keep it open to the public, and both of those are when you're living in it, it's kind of hard to do, because it maintaining the house and grounds takes a lot of effort, and when you have between 30 and 50,000 people coming through the house, you want to. Kay spends all of her day making sure that the grounds are available and the tours are done, and that's what she does.
Let me move down the line to Ann Tyler Neddick and ask if you will tell us your relationship to John Tyler.
Well, John Tyler was my great-grandfather. My father was his grandson.
Which one?
Which grandson?
Yes.
He was the son of Julia Gardner Tyler.
And your father's name?
David Gardner Tyler, Jr.
And you were for a while a professor at William and Mary, but not in the area of American history. We talked about your study of of Russia. What is your particular interest in your ancestor, John Tyler, and what can you tell us that we might not have talked about today?
Oh, well, I've always been interested in history. My studies did carry me into a different field, but maybe I could say a few words about Tyler's personal life. We know he was 6 feet tall. He was a slender build. He had light brown hair, blue eyes, and an aquiline nose, which some of us have inherited. And he had some particular hobbies, poetry writing and playing the violin. And he was particularly known for his oratorical abilities, his ability to speak. Thomas Jefferson himself said he knew of no one who spoke so well as an orator. And I think it was Jefferson Davis who said he was particularly felicitous as a public speaker. So those are a few things about his private life that may be interesting.
Ruffin Tyler next in the lineup. What is your relationship to John Tyler?
He was my great-grandfather.
And we, when we met you, we talked about the fact that you don't live here in the Tidewater any longer. You've moved up near Washington, D.C. What's the perspective of this area, your home area, from 2.5 hours away for you?
It's too far sometimes. I like coming home. There's not as much involvement with the house since I'm in Alexandria now.
But you spend the summers at Lion's Den.
We come down and spend the summers a lot. We grew up actually nearby on the river and had a lot of involvement as kids with the house and on the river nearby.
How often do people inquire about your family history?
Not too often, just because the Tyler name as a president isn't one of the top 10 picks. But when people do find out that I'm a descendant of the president, the conversations ensue.
And what do they most often want to know?
They're very interested in what's it like to be associated with the president, which on a day-to-day issue is not a whole lot, but it's kind of neat, and it does provide different avenues with other people.
Well, William Tyler and Ann Tyler Neddick, would you answer that question as well? Because I'm sure that's something that many people watching who have no personal connection with the president might wonder. What's it like to have a president in your lineage?
I think one of the great things about it is that John Tyler had so many kids that a lot of the people that you meet are, related just like we are. And that we had this reunion recently, and it was wonderful to see all the people. I mean, we had Tyler descendants from every corner of the United States, and that was really neat, talking to people from New York and from Texas and California and all.
Ann Tyler, are your thoughts?
Well, I second what William said. My husband and I own Tyler's home for when he married his first wife, Letitia Christian, and it's been very interesting restoring that place and thinking of Tyler as a young man. He was very young when he built the house, and knowing that there's a ballroom there, one of my friends said it certainly was a house that a young man would build. It has no closets, no bathroom, but it does have a ballroom.
Well, our time is quickly evaporating from us. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today as we learn more about John Tyler. Edward Crapo, we've covered a lot of history during this, but I'm going to ask you very quickly, put a cap on all this for us. What are the most important things to take away about the presidency of John Tyler?
Well, I think the most important thing to take away is that he is an underrated president. I think that as one of the relatives just mentioned, he may not be in the top 10, but he was a good president. And certainly when he left office in 1845, he felt that he had improved the state of the nation. He felt that he had enhanced the office of the presidency. He left office feeling that he had helped restore prosperity from a depression. He had helped expand trade into Asia, as we've talked about earlier. He also felt that there had been growth in commerce and manufacturing, and he believed that he had helped in terms of urban growth as well. He was, in that sense, a person who took great pride in what he thought was a fairly successful presidency. So I think what we ought to take away is that he did a far better job than he's been given credit for.
If you have any other questions for Dr. Edward Kraepel, you can find him at the History Department at the College of William and Mary, and he is working on a biography and a study of foreign policy issues in John Tyler, and we'll look for that in a couple of years. Maybe we've encouraged you to move that process along for all these interested Tyler fans out there. And special thanks as we say goodbye here, a couple others as well. Frontier Vision Cable is our affiliate in this area, and we thank them for their assistance and for bringing C-SPAN to the people who live in the Tidewater area. And most of all, to the patriarch of the family, Harrison Tyler, who is the grandson of the president, and Paney Tyler, who is the person who spent so many hours opening this place up to the public. Thank you for allowing us to bring our cameras here today and extending the reach of this to the C-SPAN audience. We appreciate your hospitality.
Thank you.
And at that point, we will say goodbye and thank you for being with us for the American President Series as we explore the life of our 10th President, John Tyler.
Thank you.